Umpire Cactus, welcome to the Kriegsspiel Umpiring Chat Show.
Thanks for having me.
It's
Appreciate
great
it.
to have you on. What part of the
Thanks.
world are you in?
I'm Dutch. I live in the Netherlands, in
Netherlands.
The Hague. Yeah, that's where
Perfect.
I hang out.
Excellent.
Yep.
I've spent time there myself, a great place to visit. I imagine also a great
Yeah.
place to live. Good for you. And how did you
Yeah,
come
pretty
to
much.
wargaming in the IKS?
Um, it's a pretty interesting story. I was always very interested in history to begin with, and I think around like when I got like 10 years old or something like that, I started getting really interested in war and like what is war? And it's just such a weird concept, two groups like killing each other and trying to murder each other. It's just weird,
Sure.
Um, and just started getting into wargaming. And after that, I found out about Kriegsspiel, which is basically what my heart always desired in wargames, with the fog of war um, aspect to it. And that was really, I think I've been in the IKS for like a year now, maybe
Okay,
two. I think
great.
I don't know, probably a
So
year,
what were
but
your first war games trying it out early on?
I think the first one I did, which was large, was Eylau. Was the Battle of Eylau,
Wow.
um, in an Open Saturday game, which was pretty tough because of the conditions historically and in the game. So that immediately got me off to a rough start, but I really enjoyed it. That hooked me, and pretty much never play other war games other than Kriegsspiel. Like nothing fulfills the itch anymore other than this
There you go.
for
Well,
me.
the
Yeah.
Alau is certainly a deep water to dive into to start off. So good for
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And what now umpiring versus playing very different. What is it about umpiring that appeals to you?
So, uh, as someone who intends to join the Dutch army as an officer, I always got really interested in basically figuring out problems, tactical problems, operational ones, stuff like that, which we do on your server a lot, which is why I enjoy it so much. And I felt that I had something to add in terms of like a more realistic Kriegsspiel experience in terms of like measuring how well you did, if that makes sense.
Right.
I try to do it more as an exercise instead of just pure for fun, if that makes sense. Um,
Yeah.
that's I think why I like it so much, and just the creativity you can have with umpiring and the cool scenarios you can make, and to put the players in interesting situations is what I enjoy out of it.
Great.
Yeah.
And you're talk about the periods that you enjoy because you're quite creative with the periods from what I've seen from your work. What periods draw your attention?
I'd say the thing I do most is World War II, just because
Right.
of the like maneuver aspect. I think in it, how fast everything happens with armor and stuff like that. Napoleonic, 7 Years War, basically everything with guns. If there's no guns, then I'm not into it. I don't like spears or bows and arrows. I'm not into that
Okay.
stuff much. But yeah,
Fair enough.
yeah.
And talk about your what kind of research do you do on World War II? So if World War II is of interest, how do you approach research and figuring out what you want to do?
So I always basically just start out with, Wikipedia. I just look
Okay.
over an interesting battle to get a good picture of the large scale of it and like how it went, stuff like that. And then depending, I might dive into a book or just read online articles. YouTube videos, of course, are also great. Um, but my eyes are definitely for asymmetric scenarios. I think those have more like operational or tactical problems to offer.
Talk
And
about
put
that a
this,
little bit. When you think of an asymmetric scenario, is that numbers of forces? Is it
yeah, could be
advantages
anything
of
really.
terrain? Talk about that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a, yeah, could be anything really. It's really just I guess how I would describe it from the player's point of view is that there is something lacking, whether it's good terrain or
Mhm.
uh, numbers or some sort of other thing, something always which is lacking, which makes you have to be creative in order to fix it or mitigate it as much as possible in order to achieve your objective. Um,
Right.
yeah,
Well,
that's basically how I approach it.
so the problem with asymmetry is, of course, is you might accidentally set up one player for success and the other just can't win. I'll give you an example. The first time I ever played James in a Kriegsspiel, he had 13 core, and I had two guys with a butter knife and one butter knife between them. And he was so happy he won that game. That's an asymmetry that didn't work very well. I won't even mention who the umpire was for that. Anyway, that's a story for another day. How do you offset that asymmetry so that the player with less advantage still has a good game or a good chance?
Yeah, so what I always try to make clear, especially when I have new players on, is that, of course, you can get into a situation where you're not going to win the battle, where it's just impossible for you to have such an impact to win the battle. But the way I kind of measure the players is more in the sense of, for what you could have done, how effective were you in your job? So, for example, you can have a scenario where your army has to retreat and it's basically crumbling.
Right.
How well are you able to then, for example, delay the enemy so the rest of the army can escape? You're never going to win that battle, but it's still about achieving or doing your job as best as you can. So it's pretty much relative. It's always relative in terms of how well you did your job. That's how
That's great. So let's talk about that. So that's a really intriguing idea. So how would you measure a person doing their job in that circumstance, or just how do you think about it?
Well, the first thing I think is important is always that the player has some sort of logic behind his action. So after the AR, I talk about, okay, why did you do this? Well, sometimes the logic is lacking. Sometimes it was a heated decision and it doesn't make much sense from his perspective. But other times, it's more about how would you say it? It's just seeing relatively what could you have done in terms of, did you make any mistakes? Was there more for you to gain? It's weird to explain without a proper example. It's kind of weird to.
Well, why don't we dive into an example? Talk about a scenario that either you played or that you umpired where you saw that being done very well, or you tried to do it well.
Yeah, so I had the Battle of Stendal, which is a fictional battle. It's, I think, north of Berlin, between a French corps and a Prussian one. Was the second game I ever did. And the Prussian commander basically had the issue of that he had a very wide line to keep, and the French basically outnumbered him and were more concentrated than him. So in that sense, from my point of view, is in terms of making the scenario, it was really the decision point was, okay, is he going to try to hold on to good ground but have a wide line, or is he going to fall back and collapse his line so he can have a shorter frontage and fight the enemy better in that scenario? He did try to hold on, but eventually did pull back. So that was kind of, from my perspective, that was a well done job. He recognized that he needed to fall back, even though his objectives told him not to, which is a second important point. We'll probably come on later. That you don't always need to achieve your objective because those rapidly change. If you're all of a sudden in front of an army, for example, and you are told to attack, well, might not be so smart to do so, even though you were told to do so, since the situation is now completely different. So yeah, it's really just relatively measure, like basically how bad could you have done and how would you been able to improve the situation.
And before the scenario starts, how much do you have it in your own conception of what a good job or a bad job would look like? In other words, do you go in saying, these are the 5 things I would like to see from this asymmetric commander, or do you say, well, let me see how it goes and then get a feel for it? Because both, I think, are
good question,
valid approaches.
The approach that I use a lot is making, before I even start with the map or the battle, I write down things. Okay, what am I interested in seeing, and like what can be achieved? And basically, I call them decision points. I'm not sure what they're really called, but just decision points in the battle. I try to write up maybe 3 or 2, which are basically large defining points in the battle where it can either go, okay, now it can go pretty wrong, or now it can go correct. And then I try to build the battle around those things. And after the scenario is set up, I then try to war game against myself to see how it goes. Although that's probably biased and doesn't work.
So you rehearse the game
Yes, correct.
solo just to get a sense for the decision points.
Yes, correct.
Well,
Yep.
that's a really interesting idea. Okay.
Yep.
Um, and how do you, when you do that solo, how do you handle decisions? Is it just kind of a nice flow that you do on your own, or do you kind of roll a die to say they would go left or right, or how do you
No,
do
I
that?
I try to basically feed intelligence to myself in terms of on the other side. So
Yeah,
if
right.
I'm playing Germans against United States, then from the United States perspective, I would try to gather. I would make a list of all the intelligence that I probably would have received at this point, and try to deduce. Okay, well, if I was unbiased, would this be enough
Yeah,
for me to make then that decision for that decision point to succeed? That's how I usually try to handle it.
yeah,
Uh,
and I think
yeah.
that sounds odd if you don't play Kriegspiel, but
Yes.
when you play Kriegspiel as an umpire, that's actually a very normal thing. Is that the way you handle non-player characters in a game? Do you kind of think in terms of that non-player character's assumptions and intelligence?
Yes, I try to do so. I try to not have like AI characters, non-player characters in
Right.
live games, as
Yeah.
then you can't really do that in such a short period. But in play by posts, definitely, yeah. That's how I always try to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
I'm going to shift up just because I've umpired you as a player, and you're a terrific player and a lot of fun to have in the server because you put a lot of
Thanks.
thought into it. Talk about this concept of line of operation. It's a unique approach to planning, and I wanted to call it out a little bit.
So, not to go into nerdy, but
Yeah.
like I
You're,
said,
you're you're speaking to a nerdy crowd,
yeah,
so
yeah, yeah. Like
don't worry about it.
I intend to join the army later, and I'm already like just out of curiosity looking in some manuals, NATO manuals. I'm not sure what they're called at the top of my head, to be honest, but
Sure.
that kind of go into okay, well, how do you effectively plan? Because back in the day, they would just it was more I wouldn't say a hunch. There was some process in it, but it was really down to the commander to figure out okay, how do I actually want to go and start efficiently planning? Whereas
Right.
now it's all worked out, so you don't forget a single thing. And I just kind of read through those, and I just take inspiration from things here and there, which I think will be useful to like either quantify or just summarize a specific point. I think the lines of operation why I think they're so useful is that they aren't really meant to be, or you can basically split. Okay, to just give a short scenario,
Yeah.
if you're on a campaign, you can always have multiple options. And what you see sometimes happen with new players is they make plans and then just always compare the plans with each other. Just everybody does their
Right.
own thing, they make a plan, that's it. What I think the line of operation does well is it basically gives you a starting point. Let's say you make three. Okay, the north one is you have to cross two rivers, the south one is a shorter route, but expect more enemy resistance, for example. So you can kind of get a feel of what each rough option would be, and then you can pick, and then you start detailed planning on that option
Right.
for the line of operation. That's, I think,
And
why
you
they're
you
useful.
oftentimes portray that as north, south, or east or west. So you use a
Yes.
directional piece, and
Yep.
it's less it's a directional steer that just says, okay, if we're gonna focus, it's really around where you're putting your main effort.
Yeah. Yeah. Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's well done.
Totally.
I think it when you do that in your planning, you create the space, if you will, for players to think about two different options truly. Because a lot of times, to your point, players aren't really debating two different options. There's one option with a bunch of details that they're debating. But you actually
Yeah.
say, no, this is a completely different focus. How do you encourage that in your players, or do you, or how do you set up a planning session? Because I think because you're a good planner, how do you in your games as an umpire set it up so the players have a good planning session?
I um I would say in the games I've been done lately, I don't really encourage it. I'd say I'm not like, hey guys, you guys need to start planning. Good luck. It's more that I try to in the material. In my
Okay.
last game I'm preparing, I'm actually made video briefings, which I
No,
think
I
are fun
saw
to
that.
do.
Yeah.
Um, and I try to give a sort of. I haven't done this as much in the lately games, but give more intrinsic details about terrain. For example, it was like in the north you have 2 rivers, in the south you have a road, or just as an example. That
Yeah.
immediately sparks like a thought. Okay, in the north I have 2 rivers, in the south I have a road. North south. Okay, those are 2 different options already. That should spark some sort of discussion
Mm-hmm.
on the players. But really, I just let it go. I don't try to steer the planning at all. I think that should be the player's job, or the CIC's job in particular.
Yeah, fair enough. And how long do you like to give your players to plan in a play-by-post, for example?
Usually around a week.
A week.
A week,
Okay.
yeah. Quite. I think that might be quite long, relatively speaking. But
What have you found? Have you gotten feedback on that, or?
not necessarily feedback. What I do sometimes see is that it's at some point it just stagnates. Usually the first 2 days, there's a lot of talking, everybody going back and forth and whatever. But like the 3rd, 4th, 5th day, it completely dies down, and then the
Yeah.
5th and the 6th day, then it's all of a sudden, oh, we need to we need to plan again. Yeah.
Yeah, you
Not
can tell
necessarily
by
feedback,
volume what's going on with the
correct.
planning.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what's your percentage live to play by post, just so we know this landscape for you?
I think it's about half at the moment.
Half-half,
I'm in my
okay.
3rd live game currently, and I've done 3 play-by-posts.
Okay. Great.
And I think I tend to gravitate more to live games for some reason.
Why do you think that is?
Especially in World War II, it's sometimes so fast-paced that I think it's I wouldn't say disrespectful, that's the wrong word, but kind of, what's the word? Maybe disingenuous. It's kind of to the commanders that operated in the battle historically. For example,
Right.
Battle of the Bulge. There are points where you have to, as a battalion commander, for example, make very rapid decisions. And taking 3 days, because it's a play-by-post, to work out every option and really dig into each option, I think also kind of, I wouldn't say it's always as realistic.
Yeah.
So that's why I tend to gravitate to more live games, because they put the player really in I need to make a decision within the next 5 minutes sometimes.
Yeah, right.
Which is
And
what
what
I like,
scale
yeah.
do you operate these World War II games at? Are you a battalion level or brigade level, or what's your preference?
So my preference is that the battalion is the smallest piece, usually up to the division.
Okay. Sure,
I tend
right.
to do smaller games, like 4v4, sometimes 6v6, but
Yeah, those are
yeah.
equally fun if you get the.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I like those
so
the
you
most.
do a division on division, generally going down to battalion level. And what's your inspiration for the rule set?
So, oh man, I don't forgot what the original rules were called, but
Sure.
I've kind of gathered some stuff out of real tabletop wargaming, and also some already set rules in the Kriegsspiel, because there aren't a lot of battalion level pieces, lowest pieces rules out there, basically. So I kind
Right.
of mismatch, and I would be honest. For me, the rules are not always the most important in terms of
Okay.
very little specifics. That's not what it's about for me. It's more, like I said, like creating the problem and figuring out the problem. That's really it for me. That the players make the best decisions they can under that circumstance. That's
And so, talk through your rules, your implementation approach rather than rules.
Yeah.
So, how do you do movement and communication in a World War II division level game?
So the movement, I split it between the different types of units: armor, mechanized, motorized,
Sure.
infantry. And the communication is actually pretty interesting, because I've been trying out something lately, which is in live games, I try to do one turn every 15 minutes. And of
Yeah.
those 15 minutes, each team gets 5 minutes radio time per turn.
Okay.
It's kind of, I don't want it to be as much of a back and forth where the lower command basically just asks his higher commander, okay, I'm in this situation, what do you want me to do? I don't like that, because I want to force the lower commands to make decisions that affect, everyone else, and not and have to do that themselves. And that's been working great, actually. I got great feedback on that. People really enjoyed that, because
That's
it's
interesting. How do you implement that, like mechanically? How
yeah.
do you
So
implement it?
I have an app on my phone, which allows me to have multiple timers with different colors.
Huh.
And I give everyone their report. And once I've done the last player on their team, I click the timer on, and I basically, in a radio Discord channel, I basically post the word open to let them know, okay, now this is open, talk as much as you want. And after 5 minutes, the timer for that respective team goes off, and then I just type closed, and then everybody stops talking in that channel, and then they need to do what they should
But
do.
they still have access to it, but it's just
Yes, correct. Yeah.
So that's interesting. So
Yep.
it removes, as an umpire, the need to change roles or drag people in and
Yeah.
out and all that stuff. There's just
Yeah.
And they're typing text.
They're
basically,
typing it,
text
correct.
count.
Yeah, correct.
That's super
Yes.
interesting. So you just put
Yep.
closed and open, or open and closed. Oh, that's
Yeah,
okay.
that's
neat.
simple. Yeah.
And so that augments a form of communication in a live game where the umpire doesn't have to do a lot of clicking, basically.
Yeah. And it's
Clever.
really, like I said, to just put a bit more, put the lower commanders in a more tough position to.
And what are you
make their own,
simulating there with the 5-minute piece in terms of if you
So I
telescope out
figure,
to a quasi real situation? There's radios, there's combat. What are you aiming for there?
yeah. So each turn takes 1 hour, and I try to think of it in a way of, as a real battalion commander for that hour. Maybe
Right.
the first 20 minutes, you're gathering the info. Of course, the reports I give to the players is immediately basically a long list of what's happening. But in a real battle, that comes in piecemeal by piecemeal, so you don't immediately have a full picture. So I simulate, like, okay, 1/3 of the hour is gathering the info, what is happening around me as a real commander. Then the next 20 minutes is basically, okay, you're communicating, you're coordinating, what do we want to do, stuff like that. Sending
Yep.
reports to other players. And then the last 20 minutes, you work on implementing the orders that you want to actually do. Like, I'm going to tell that platoon to do that, that company to do that, for example.
Yeah,
So,
and then so in your 15-minute
Yes.
analog, the 5-minute bit represents 1/3 of the time.
Yes, correct.
Okay.
That is correct, yeah.
And the player feedback's good, you said.
Yeah, I got feedback on it. I was actually kind of skeptical that it would work because I was afraid it was going to basically force people to type very quickly and panicky, and, but it actually wasn't like that at all, at least with those players. It was very controlled and structured. Every message I read back made sense. And I felt like that could have been sent in a realistic radio message. So
well, that's a unique technique. I hope our umpire listening audience plays around with that idea. That's a good one. What are some other? How do you handle air in your World War II scenarios? That's always a frothy topic.
Yeah, I like to have air more of a. You can't really necessarily request it. You just have it when you have it, and when you don't, you don't. So one turn, I'll just be for the divisional commander, for example. Hey, 2 P-47s called in. They're available for a strike. They need to happen in this turn because otherwise they might get called in by someone else, for example.
Right.
Yeah, but I don't tend to use them much, as I always try to find some sort of excuse why they wouldn't play a large role, either because the battle's at night or because it's the Battle of the Bulge and there's bad weather or something like that. I don't really tend to use them much in my games.
Right.
Yep.
It's hard because it dwarfs the scale, and you create this kind of divine-like effect of air could just show up at different times.
Yeah.
Having played with that a little bit myself, I understand the challenge there.
Yeah.
So World War II is a big, sprawling enterprise on the world part. Which theaters are the most interesting to you?
So for me, the most interesting theater, which if there was one thing that I needed to research for the rest of my life, I would pick that, would be the Pacific War.
Really?
Yeah, definitely. I think what makes it so interesting for me is like what interests me in the Napoleonic era is that it's not an entire front. You have individual pieces which basically can maneuver to achieve a certain task. Now that's the same with, granted, that's the same with Africa and Rommel and some other battles in World War II. But it's really I like the freedom. Like, a ship can go anywhere. Like, they could, if they wanted, they could just attack Japan like they did with Doolittle, for example. So that's why it interests me a lot. strategically and also just culturally with the Japanese and how they went about their battles really interests me a
Okay.
lot. Yeah.
Well, that certainly is a big sprawling enterprise on that end of the world for sure. So that's
Yeah,
so interesting.
definitely. Yeah.
Um, so naval versus ground combat. What recognizing you've done three live, three play by post. Where do you think your attention is going to go? More toward the naval, or are you going to stay on land?
I always like to have them combined. The
Okay.
game I'm also currently still in process of is a sort of campaign for Guadalcanal. It's with
Okay.
naval players and ground players. Because in the end of the day, for me, the Navy serves the purpose of the Marines or the Army. Because in the end, you need to get men on a certain position on the ground to win a
Right.
war. At least how I see it most of the time. Um, and
Don't
that's,
let
I
the
think,
Navy guys hear you say that.
yeah. Oh God. Oh Jesus. Yeah.
Trust me
Not
on that.
always, of course, but at least in Guadalcanal, that's how I see it that way. That the Navy
Yeah,
is
yeah,
really just making sure the transports for the infantry stay around, for example. And I
yeah,
really
yeah.
try to in that game create the feeling that the Navy is responsible for the well-being of the Marines. Like if you screw up right now, then the Marines are going to be a whole lot of trouble on the ground. I'm going to have a more tough job um, against the Japanese if they eventually land. Which that
Right.
game is going great right now. The U.S. Navy did lose, but uh, yeah,
Yeah.
the Marines are holding out. So
And so, operational level or campaign across an entire theater versus a tactical. How do you approach mixing the two, or are you operating mostly at one level?
yeah, so what I tend to do, at least with Guadalcanal, is I try to have for the Navy a sort of strategic map and a tactical map of certain areas where I think will be battle. Whereas for the Marines, it's just their tactical. They don't have to worry about strategic stuff at all. Um, and what I
Sure.
would do sometimes is just skip multiple days for the Marines. I'd just be okay. Next turn, likely nothing going to happen. It's going to skip 3 days, for example. And then as the the Japanese land on the island, uh, then we would just go
Then it
continuously in a
becomes tactical.
tactical. Yeah,
Sure.
correct. Yeah.
And what's you play by post for the campaign bit, and then live for the tactical, or what is your thoughts on that?
No, so that campaign is purely play by post. I could
Play by
not do
post.
that live. That would be way too way too in depth. Um, yeah,
Yeah. Sure.
I tend to do like battalion level, lowest piece live games.
Right.
I haven't done any lower than that.
Well,
Yeah,
it's a problem that all umpires face that try to mix the two. If you
yeah, it's
call
definitely
in a bunch
tricky.
of players to do a tactical implementation inside a larger campaign, those
Yeah,
players that just show up don't have the context, and it's hard to quickly brief them on, okay, here's the 27 turns of theater level maneuvering that's been going
yeah,
on that created this battle.
yeah.
Um, so if it's all play by post, at least you have some room there. And it's the same players who play at the campaign level then play tactical.
Yeah, so what I also do to fix that problem you just talked about is each. So first of all, it's in two separate servers. You have the Japanese server and you have the American server. So there's no, I can see how
Right.
many players are my enemy or whatever. Um, I have an Intel channel which basically pushes Intel from, for example, Washington or like Sinpac Command or whatever, just higher, extremely high formations that the code breakers, for example, that gather intelligence on the enemy. Um,
Right.
and I would just stream that in, maybe one report every 2 turns about, okay, some sort of offensive might happen between now or next week. Uh, Stuff like that. I try to keep it vague and not have it too in depth. And it also forces radio silence for the players and to use code words for the players to make
Okay.
their own code books. So
And I've done two servers myself. So what's the advantage that you find with two servers versus one with the different roles and different channels?
yeah, so why I did that is so you could have player roles be their units. So you can have the 14th Regiment as a role. So you can just give him and all his staff that role. And if he's co-located with something else, all they need to do is just allow that role in another channel, and then everybody from that HQ immediately has access to it. So you don't have to
Right.
individually click players and stuff. I found that extremely tedious. Um,
Okay.
Yeah, that's why. Yeah,
I split two servers because I found that players were gaming the
yeah, that
size
as
of
well.
the enemy based on seeing the different colors and roles, and they were spending a lot of time talking about, oh, Joe is, and Jane, they play this way and stuff like that. So it
Yep.
basically, you didn't know who was on the other side at all. But in other channels where people don't do that as much, I use one server, but it's good. Okay.
Yeah, same reasoning for me. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Correct.
Which brings us to players. How do you approach finding players, getting players in? There's a pretty hot, of course, we're in June of 25, and there's a hot discussion right now in the active umpires channel about,
Yeah. So yeah.
do you have a set number of players? Do you open it up to a larger group? How do you approach that?
So I always try to, at least, like, I have some friends in other games, like, for example, Arma or just basically other games that I know, hey, you might be interested in this in Kriegsspiel. Do you want to try it out? And I always try to
Right.
give them, okay, I'm going to do a game here. If you want to come, you'll have priority. You can test it out, and hopefully you'll have fun. And then what I mostly do is I open it up, allow people to join, and I usually only pick the CIC
Okay.
beforehand, and then let the commands, either the CIC chooses who takes what, or I choose who takes what. But in
Yeah.
terms of who plays, I don't have a blacklist or whatsoever. I just take whoever. I take randomly some experience that I know, some new players that I know haven't played much. So there's a good mix.
But you do keep
CICs.
the CIC choice pretty much to you so that you can steer it that way. Okay.
Usually I would say yes. Yeah,
That
correct.
works, yeah. And then how many players? You mentioned two by two or smaller games for live. How many players in your play by post?
I think now there's like I think maybe 16,
Okay.
like 8 per side, excluding
Yeah.
staff. I'd say. I think that's a pretty
And how
good
long
number.
is a resolution for 16 channels, or do you have those in staff? So it's actually kind of half the number of resolutions. How many resolutions do you do per turn? I guess is a better way to ask.
It's a tough. I think for individual units, like I think maybe 12 or so. 12
Okay.
different commanded units. I
You
resolve.
got a little bit of work with your radio channels if you're doing that kind of stuff, your intel channels and all that. So 12.
Yeah,
Okay.
for the PBM games, I just leave the radio open. That I don't even try
right.
to. No, I don't.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
And how long does a resolution usually take for you?
quite long. I think the system is quite in depth. I've tried to quantify it a little bit, make it a bit more simple. I think I do about maybe an hour or two to
That's pretty good, though.
resolve. Yeah.
Speaking from experience and having talked to a lot of umpires through text on Discord, some will go up to 4 hours, but an hour or two is not so bad.
Yeah.
I find 2 hours is I can't seem to get away from the 2 hour resolution.
Yeah.
Myself. So that's not good. That's not too bad at all. What are some of the more detailed aspects? You just mentioned you got some complexity in there that you're working on. What are some of those things that you find being more complex and you like it?
Good question. Well, that's a very interesting question. I think might be not answering your question fully, but what is sometimes too complex for me is the orders players give, and I try to very much emphasize that in the introduction that, hey, you are a regiment commander. You don't have to worry about making sure the guys have camouflage clothing on or whatever. Like I try to be, and I also try to basically limit options a little bit. I wrote a recent World War II handbook for my live games, which is like you basically have like 8 options in terms of the large things to order, like recon, enforce, attack, defend, hold. And I try to define those words a little bit so they have a good idea of what each one means, so it doesn't get overly complicated with their orders. Which is the beauty of Kriegsspiel.
Your resolution, is your combat system complex?
Yeah, it's relatively speaking, no, but for me, it sometimes is, with a lot of stuff happening.
Talk us through it and what you do for combat.
So for combat, I check the supply of the unit, which with Guadalcanal is has a huge part in it due to the lack of supply. And depending on that, I just add DRMs to dice roll. And then depending on what the player ordered, it's either multiple dice rolls or just one. For example, in an assault where you're actually trying to take a trench, I just keep rolling until something decisive happens, usually.
Right.
Whereas otherwise I don't. But the large part of the resolution is probably the flow of supply and keeping that managed, because that's quite complex, I'd say.
And how do you? I'm going to come back to the resolution in a sec, but in
Yeah.
terms of if I have a battalion on the board, how do you know what its level of supply is? Do you keep it on the piece or do you keep that on a chart?
I keep it on the piece and on the chart, both.
Two places. Okay.
Yeah, two places, just in case.
Okay. Well, that might be one area to look at. But I got you. And then in terms of die rolling, is it a table or is it die v die? In other words, a red die and a white die, whichever one's higher, kind of thing.
Oh, it's a more of a hit die. Like it's
Hit
of
die,
a
okay.
yeah, it's basically a hit and a morale die. And each side basically rolls for their own, for what they inflict on the enemy, basically.
Okay, got it. And
Yeah.
so two units line up, they both roll a die. That's what they're inflicting on the other. Generally, the one who rolls higher is going to inflict more, as a rule. Okay.
Yeah, usually, but not always.
Yeah.
I think what the system really hammers on is the quality of troops, and also which is, I think, historically correct, is that you can attack a single enemy with, for example, 3 battalions. You can do that, and it probably will work, but that will also cause more casualties. The more people you throw at something, the more casualties will come away from it, which is what is a large part of the role. So it isn't necessarily, you shouldn't overcommit your troops with my system, as it will cause unnecessary casualties.
Yeah. Okay. That's always an interesting balance. I think a lot of combat systems, when you have evenly sized units, you get these nice, beautifully articulated combat results tables and die rolls. Then suddenly, when it's 4-1, the results have to be fully adjusted to have it make sense, right? So because it's not necessarily going to be a 1/4 level of damage, to your point.
Yeah, correct.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
And then, what are you working on now? What games are in the hopper right now?
So I have a game this Thursday in 2 days, which will be a live one. It's just the Battle of the Bulge, which I made the videos for.
Okay.
And then after that, I have basically 2 further games I intend to plan out. One is the Nomonhan incident, or Battle of Khalkhin, which is the Mongol Soviet versus the Manchukuo and Japanese army. And I think the Battle of or the Nomonhan incident is such an interesting one because it played a huge role in basically the Soviet diplomatic strategy in World War II, as well as Japan's, which I thought would be interesting, an interesting thing to explore, because it's 2 armies basically fighting in a mechanized battle against each other, basically for the first time, which is why I thought it was so interesting.
And this is right at the end of the war, where the Soviets were trying to exert some influence on the.
No, this is actually at the beginning. This is actually before, like 1939, before the Molotov-Ribbentrop for whatever pact got signed.
See, I learned something today. Okay. And how did you stumble across this and find this as an interesting topic?
Yeah, it was actually quite interesting. I was just looking on Google Maps, so like, where are places that I would want to go, just in terms of traveling in real life? And then I was like, Mongolia and this area up here. Were there any battles up here that were important? And then I just started looking it up, and then I just came across, and it was, wow, it's a fascinating battle. I think it's a really interesting battle.
Play by post?
Yeah, play by post. Yeah.
How many players do you think you'll have in that one?
Also probably around the 16.
16.
16 individual commands. Yes.
Okay. Good for you. That's great.
Yeah.
And then the bulge. What are you doing for the bulge? Certainly, it's a well modeled and well trod territory. You could probably look out your window and see areas where it happened. What is it you're going to bring to that game? You think that'll bring a little something a little different?
I think for that one, it's actually, my intent was really to make it a more standard game because of the amount of new people that I have in the game.
Okay.
I think like 75% of all players in that game are new, including a person who was doing CIC for the first time.
Okay.
So it's really more of a standard. It is quite asymmetric still. The Germans have a bit more forces and a bit better equipment in terms of the combat, basically. But yeah, I try to make it a bit more standard. I'm not trying to emphasize on the snow or the weather a lot. I know it was a big part, but I don't want to do it as much to give the new players a bit more of an easier jump into Kriegsspiel.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
All right. So, if you were to give advice to a new umpire, given your
Mm-hmm.
experience and how you've learned how to umpire, what advice would you give someone coming new, fresh on the scene?
That I think what I would give advice to the umpire is that one, the briefing is the most important. The briefings that you make, and it might seem a bit weird, but the specific words that you choose in your briefing have a huge impact on how the battle will go. We see it, of course, we emphasize it a lot on commanding players in terms of, hey, the messages you write and the orders you give can be interpreted differently, but it's just as much, if not more, with umpire written briefings. Because if you tell CIC to in its briefing to attack a point and to seize a point, that can already be interpreted very differently and have a different outcome in your battle.
Yeah,
So
right.
I take a long time if I were a new umpire to really look in depth. Okay, what am I actually writing here for the players? Because it might
That
seem simple,
setup,
but it's
right?
pretty complicated, I think. Yeah.
And now you've evolved to a video briefing. Talk about what you found there in doing that.
I think it's one fun because it's a bit more immersive in terms of the what you want to do. And secondly, I think that it serves as a I make the videos in such a way that if they take notes, they should be able to follow along and have their own little briefing written. And I think when you're speaking, and maybe that's just for me, but when I hear someone talk instead of reading something, I interpret it a bit differently with their
Uh-huh.
tone and the urgency in their voice. Um, and I think that what makes it interesting. And of course, that you can have animations. That's a huge point. That you can, for example, try to point on a map and then from here use that road to attack there, for example. Um,
What's your technical setup that allows you to put these together? Because I
oh,
did have a chance to watch one of them. So
I I just used I use Inkscape to make the maps and to draw on the
okay.
maps. Then I just put them in a PowerPoint. I just click record. I talk and I just skip the slides as I keep going. That
So you're
basically
recording
creates the
into the
animations.
PowerPoint.
Yeah.
What's capturing the audio file?
Uh, GeForce Experience, I think it's called. Yeah,
Okay.
GeForce Experience. I'm very inexperienced with editing and all that stuff, so I'm still really figuring that out. But
No, that's fine.
yeah,
I think it's an important point for other umpires to realize that making recordings is not that complicated because most of the technology is on our computers
that is
organically,
true. Yeah, yeah,
and you
correct.
don't need to buy a lot of stuff.
Yeah, didn't need to buy
Um,
anything at all. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
okay, cool. And what would you? So we have about 120 live umpires as of this recording.
Ooh,
Um,
damn.
what can we do as an umpire community to improve the experience of umpiring and supporting each other?
Ooh, good question. Um, I'd say I'd definitely like to see more, and maybe I'm missing a lot of them, but definitely a lot more AARs, but also because I think with AARs we focus a lot on the players and how the players did, but also from an umpire perspective, I think that's a bit lacking in terms of an AAR that talks about, okay, well, what was my vision for this battle? What did I want from this battle? What actually came out of it? And what could I have done better next time to shape this battle more into something that I would have wanted, if that is something that I want,
That's a
for
super interesting
example.
point, right?
Because yeah,
Sharing our own insights and experience with each other, so we can
yeah,
learn from these efforts that we put in, because
yeah.
so much effort goes in. Yeah,
I think, and I've done it myself either. I'm not saying that like I'm doing it perfectly, but more in the sense, I think that's what as a community we could probably do better. We could probably talk it like be a bit more critical on ourselves in terms of umpiring, so others can learn
that's
from
a
our
good point.
mistakes that we
Okay.
make.
In the
Yeah.
AAR format and allowing a little room for our own feedback. I think that's a great
Yeah.
point. Anything we missed today?
I don't think so. I think
Great.
yeah, we pretty much gone over every game I've done, I believe.
Good.
Yeah.
Well, you're a great player, and you put a lot of energy into this, and you're certainly carry that over into your umpiring, experimenting with things like the video briefings, those kind of things. Shows a lot of energy and innovations. That's super, and really appreciate you coming on here and talking about how you umpire.
Thanks for having me. I think I've been listening to all of these, and they were always very interesting and different perspectives. So I'm glad I can give mine.
This will be one of those for sure. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, thanks.